Good morning. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me okay? Noam, thanks for having me. I look forward to your grilling a little bit later on. Today's theme is the dilemmas that journalists face in war zones. And when you're there, you realize quite the full range of dilemmas. There's big ones that can threaten your life. There's small ones like which Iraqi shawarma are you going to eat is going to give you food poisoning later on. It runs the big gamut. We've heard about some of them already. But I think you can basically boil this broad range of dilemmas down into three main headings. And I would describe them as, am I right there? Technical issues. It's good to work in newspapers because you don't have all the equipment. I would break the three kind of main fields of dilemmas down into safety. How do you keep your team safe? How do you keep yourself safe while you're out in the world? We saw that horrifying graph earlier of all the journalists who've been killed in the last few years. Number two, not playing into the terrorists' hands. How do you do your work? How do you report on what they're doing without doing their work for them? And three, how do you manage the relationship with counter-terror forces, with government authorities? How do you embed without going native, without telling their story also? So I just want to start. I was in northeastern Syria in March, and we were at a base belonging to the Asaj, which is the Kurdish intelligence forces there. And we're sitting in a big gray room, like this room. All the windows were boarded up. It was March. It was freezing cold. The only decoration there was a portrait of Abdullah Öcalan, who is the Kurdish leader who's revered by Kurdish fighters in Syria. He's considered a terrorist by the US and by Turkey, but that's a different story. And we're sitting there, and we're drinking tea, and we're trying to stay warm. And the door opens, and the Kurdish intelligence officers come in, and they're bringing this man with him. He's this thin guy. He's wearing just a galabiya, even though it's so cold. And his name is Mohammed Anwar Mia, and he's a 40-year-old British man suspected of joining the Islamic State. He had been captured by the Syrian Democratic Forces in Syria, and he's now waiting in a Kurdish prison to see what the world is going to do with him. And I'll come back to his story in a couple of minutes because I think it illustrates some of the dilemmas that journalists face. But first of all, just that main heading, that number one heading, safety. This event is in honor of Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street Journal reporter. And I think that's totally appropriate because his death in 2002 completely changed the way that journalists cover terrorism, the way journalists interact with terrorists. Bernard-Henri Lévy, with his shirt buttoned down to here a little earlier, described his death as a thunderstorm in relations, and I think that's totally right. It feels crazy to say it, but remember, in the 1990s, journalists used to sit down with major terrorist leaders all the time, right? So bin Laden did, between 1993 and 1998, interviews with The Independent, with CNN, with ABC, with Time Magazine. And it's basically unthinkable that that would happen today. You can't even imagine that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi would emerge from wherever he's hiding in the western Iraqi desert to sit down and do an interview with NBC. Today, as a journalist, you're far more likely to be beheaded by a jihadist group than you ever are to get a sit-down interview with them. And so the question is, why has that changed? Why in the 90s, before 9/11, did they talk with us, and afterwards they just chop our heads off? And I think there are two main reasons. Number one, these groups have become so much more nihilistic and so much more violent than they used to be. They really don't care anymore what Western publics think about them in the sense of are they right or are they wrong, where they used to be much more interested in making their case. And number two, and perhaps more importantly, they just don't need us anymore. They don't need the mainstream media to get their message out to millions of people anymore. They can do it, just like Western politicians, they can do it through Twitter, they can do it through YouTube, they can do it through their own social media channels. The American journalist Jeffrey Goldberg was a friend of Daniel Pearl's, and he wrote an excellent essay in 2014 called Before the Beheadings, and he talked about this phenomenon that terrorist groups don't need the media anymore. He wrote, "The extremists don't need us anymore. 14 years ago, while I was staying at a Taliban madrasa, its administrators were launching a website. I remember being amused by this, but I shouldn't have been. There's no need for middleman now. Journalists have been replaced by YouTube and Twitter. And when there's no need for us, we become targets." And journalists in war zones are relatively easy targets. We're foreigners, we're traveling around, we have obviously less capabilities than foreign militaries, foreign intelligence agencies. For the most part, as far as I know, Western journalists in war zones don't travel with armed security. The rationale being that if you're moving around with teams with guns, then you're not really a neutral observer anymore. You're a combatant in a field full of armed people. There's some debate about whether that's a smart thing to do or not, but I hope that norm holds out. We talked earlier about Steven Sotloff. He was a freelance journalist, and his death, his murder, and the murder of other journalists like James Foley has really affected the way that large organizations use freelance journalists anymore, because they're concerned if you send somebody into the field, if you're taking their work, then you also have obligations to them. You have duties to them if they end up in the horrible situation that somebody like Steven Sotloff ended up. And sadly, this means that we're using fewer freelancers than we used to. And finally, just on safety, everything I say obviously is from the perspective of a white Western journalist working for a big foreign media organization. The challenges facing our local colleagues, our translators, our guides, our fixers, our drivers are much different. They often don't have the same protections that we do. They stay in theater after we leave. They can face potential reprisals from terrorist groups, from governments who don't like the stories that we wrote, that we went back to Britain and got awards for. So that is obviously also something that you need to keep in mind. The second big dilemma, I think, is just not playing into the terrorists' hands, not doing their work for them. As Moran talked about earlier, terrorism is by definition a public act of violence. It's designed to affect attitudes in other countries. It's designed to affect government policy. It's the theater of terror. And whether or not the terrorists succeed in that goal depends partly on how we cover them. So you have to strike a careful balance. How do you tell the public what terrorists are doing? How do you tell them why they're doing it without basically doing their work for them and becoming their unwitting mouthpieces? The reality is we haven't always got that balance right. When the Islamic State first burst onto the scene in 2014, they brought with them this made-for-TV, high-quality level of violence that we really just hadn't seen before. They used great video, they used great editing, they used great sound, very high production values. Jihadi John, the man who killed Steven Sotloff, who killed James Foley, he spoke in English, and the whole point of that was that so what he was saying would be accessible to Western audiences in the US, the UK, etc. And too often we fell for it. We ran their footage. We put those pictures of those dramatic images of the terrorist all in black, standing up with the knife and the hostage on his knees in orange in the sand. We put those images in our newspapers. And I think today a lot of journalists would realize that was a mistake, and we didn't get it right. At the Telegraph, we have guidelines now about how we use any images that comes directly from terrorist propaganda. We're very careful about using the word executed when we talk about terrorists killing people, because executed implies that there was some sort of judicial process, which there wasn't in these cases. And our policies, I think, are much more robust than they used to be. You're seeing similar debates now with right-wing terrorism, like in New Zealand and the US and Europe, where you have these guys who go, they carry out massacres, they publish a manifesto online, and there's a question of how much of that manifesto should you publish, how much should you spread these people's ideas into the world. And then, just finally, in terms of doing the terrorist work for them, in northeast Syria, we're facing a new and quite specific dilemma. We have people like Mohammed Anwar Mia, who is a suspected terrorist. He's in Kurdish custody. He is willing to talk to the Western media. He's been inside the Islamic State for 4 years. He knows how things work. He's somebody who you absolutely want to talk to. You want to hear what he has to say. You want to hear what kind of information he has. But he obviously has an agenda too. And his agenda, as he sits in his galabeah in this cold room in the Kurdish intelligence base, is to say that he did nothing wrong. He basically never heard of ISIS. He had no idea they were killing people. He just made a bad mistake. He came to Syria for humanitarian reasons. And if you let him go back to Britain, he will restart and be an upstanding citizen. And that is the story you're hearing from all of these guys. And there are hundreds of them in Kurdish custody in northeastern Syria. So as someone who went and sat and talked with him and heard this story, you face questions afterwards about what are we going to do with this? And I don't think there's much value to just repeating his claims, which aren't verifiable, that he didn't know what was happening and he's very sorry, etc. So in the case of this interview, we basically used the information we got from him to do a story about how Western intelligence agencies deal with these guys, how they extract information from them, what they find is useful, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last dilemma is just how do you manage your relationship with the counterterrorism forces, with the government authorities? If you're in Syria, how do you deal with the Syrian Democratic Forces? If you're in Iraq, how do you deal with the Iraqi government, with the Shia militias, with the quote-unquote good guys? In our story with Mohammed Anwar Mia, one of the things we learned is that MI6, the British intelligence agency, isn't actually speaking directly to these guys who are in British citizen, British suspected terrorist, but they don't speak directly to them because they're concerned that if they do, it gives them a legal foothold to eventually come back to Britain, to go to the courts and to come back home. And one disturbing trend we've found as British journalists is that Western security services basically want us to do their work for them. So they're not going and speaking to people like this directly, but they're very happy to piggyback off our work. And so when we were sitting in that cold room with the picture of Öcalan on the wall, the Kurdish intelligence officers set up a small camera next to us, and they were recording our interview. And there's no doubt in my mind that they're recording it to send back to the British security services. And similarly, British police recently tried to take the notes of journalists who interviewed Shamima Begum, who's a particularly notorious British woman who's joined the Islamic State, and she's in one of these camps in Syria. And the goal was to try to build up evidence to prosecute her when she went back to the UK. Unfortunately, that effort failed in court. A judge said that you can't do that. But it's a disturbing trend because we're there as journalists. We're not there to do the work of Western security services. And it is a trend, I think, that we should be resisting. In terms of your relations with government agencies and with them trying to piggyback off your work, we live in 2019. All our electronic communications, I think, are vulnerable to interception. There's a limited amount you can do with that if you're a journalist and you have state actors like the US, UK, Israel who are interested in your communications, but it's just something to be aware of. And then finally, in terms of embedding, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the good guys who defeated ISIS in Syria, they're the ones who are essentially in charge in northeast Syria. If you want to get anything done, you have to make nice with them. But they have their own agenda also, and they have a lot of influence over people who are working in the area, the translators, the fixers, the drivers, etc. And we found while we were there that they were exerting a lot of pressure on translators not to tell us the kind of things that would make them look bad. And that's an example of someone, a group that has done an amazing job defeating ISIS, that is almost universally considered the heroes of this story, but they're not above using underhand tactics, and it's something you need to think about as a journalist. So I'd say those are the big three dilemmas: safety, how do you not do the terrorist work for them, how do you manage your relationships with government authorities. The dilemmas change over time. They're different from situation to situation. We as an industry, I don't think, have done a perfect job by any standards, but I hope we're doing better. I hope we're getting our guidelines together. So thank you very much.